Welcome back to another episode of Seek Bytes, a podcast by engineers for engineers. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking to the CEO and co-founder of Jamie.ai, Sreyna Rath. Sreyna is going to be talking to us about some of the responsibilities we have as engineers for when using AI and creating AI. We'll talk about some of the ethical implications and some of the moral ones of AI. Stick around to find out more on Seek Bytes. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about responsible AI, and we have a special guest, the CEO and co-founder of Jamie.ai, Sreyna Rath. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm terrible with names.
You did it perfectly. Chef's kiss.
Fantastic. And she has joined us today to talk about responsible AI, which is something I'm very passionate about and not knowledgeable about. So a little bit about Sreyna. I saw her as one of the keynote speakers at DDD earlier in the year, and I was like, this person is fantastic and has a really great attitude towards AI. And she gave a talk about the kind of villains of AI and how we can maybe reform them into heroes, which I thought was a really great analogy, and it kind of captured me. So when we were doing this season, I was like, I'd love to talk to this person. And amazingly, she said yes. So welcome to the Seek Bytes podcast, Sreyna.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Arnav is joining us today. So Sreyna, why don't you give us kind of the one-on-one about yourself and how you ended up co-founding a company about AI?
Yeah, I did computer science at university, and straight after that degree, I spent 11 years at Accenture. Then I went into startups, right? And if you've worked at a startup before, you know that, yes, it is really, hectic and fulfilling, but also you kind of have to love pain to be there. So I spent about 7 years in startups, and then it was back in 2022 when ChatGPT first came out, and I became a super user. And I was using it for like literally everything. And I didn't like my role at the time. And so naturally, I turned to ChatGPT and I said, I don't like my role at the moment. What should I say to my boss? And it came back and it said, you should tell your boss that you're good at baking and multitasking, which horrified me because I am like really bad at both, right? And so I was like, oh, the reason why it came up with that was because I'm a female developer. I'm a female in tech, right? And it didn't care about anything else. It just reduced me to gender stereotypes. And then so naturally I went down a rabbit hole and wanted to find out why it was giving me these sorts of answers. And I saw as well that, there is a huge problem with AI is obviously bias and gender bias. And so I knew I wanted to create something that was kind of for women. And so I called up my co-founder and I told her what I'd found. And, we knew that we wanted to create an AI companion because we didn't want to build another kind of a marketing tool or something where only kind of, corporate women would use it. We wanted to use something, we wanted to build something that the everyday woman could use. And so hence that's how Jamie came about. For someone who doesn't actually understand what AI is, which is a really good pattern matching machine, they probably wouldn't really question it. And then it gets to a point, when they take all of AI's answers as the truth. And that's where it can be dangerous.
Yeah, especially right now when people are using ChatGPT and all of these AI companions for literally everything. They're using it as a therapist and everything as well. And for something like this to play into that experience, for it to tell you all of these very regress thoughts, it's really messed up.
I think there's really obviously some ethical questions around like, what should we be using AI for and what should we not? Like when you say kind of digital therapist, for me, I have a knee-jerk reaction. It's like, but it's a computer. It's like, how has it been programmed? What is it trained on? And I'm like, not knowing anything about the underlying.
Even my partner uses ChatGPT all the time. And for that like to be able to like happen to someone. It's like normal people are not thinking about this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. They did release something around the most popular use cases for ChatGPT, and therapist and companionship was the top use case.
Wow.
Right. And it wasn't summarizing emails, it wasn't coding, it was, here are my deepest thoughts, scrutinize and give me empathy or whatever. And that's actually not a surprise given the climate right now, which is, if I have a thought that's different from everyone else, will I be judged for it? And I think as well, we have this assumption that we all have friends that we can talk to, but we actually don't. And we call Jamie the digital donut, and it's that sweet spot in between your friend and your therapist, because not everyone has that friend that can be empathetic, but then also give them that pushback. But just because you have these thoughts or you don't have that friend, it doesn't mean that you need a therapist as well. And so from the get-go, we knew, okay, vulnerable users will be using our product. How do we design for the vulnerable? But also, we don't want to be a mental health product. We want mental health to be something that's provided by humans and by experts. So despite that, we still have a mental health advisory board, and we still build to make sure that if someone is in crisis or is vulnerable, they have, the steps to point them to a real human.
As engineers using this AI, so we might be building it or we might just be using it. What are the kind of responsibilities that, how should we be using the AI to be responsible, or what are our responsibilities, do you think?
So I'm coming at this as a coder myself, right? So I think every PR that you raise is a decision. It's around, did I include extra safeguards in there? Did I choose the right data set? Is it representative of someone who doesn't look like me? Because as a dev, your experience isn't universal. And we do know as well that most devs are male. So how do you make sure that your blind spots are covered, right? We talk about how one biased person can affect a few hundred people, but then you build those values into AI and that harm compounds. And so if you're going to scale your judgment with AI, you have to make sure that your judgment is actually worth scaling, right? And I think there's something powerful in that we actually have, as devs, we have the power to do something really good, because I know that most devs are good people. They wouldn't ship something harmful. So the problem isn't malice. It's the fact that we've been trained to optimize on, does it work? But we need to now shift that, and we need to start asking, does it work fairly? And so at the keynote, I did talk about Amazon's hiring algorithm, right? Which it was supposed to help them go through their millions of applicants. And what they found was it was trained on 10 years worth of their resumes, which were largely male developers. And so what their algorithm was doing was it was punishing or penalizing CVs that had the word women in it, right? Because it had inferred that all successful candidates are male. So if you're not male, or if you don't fit this idea of success, then you will be penalized for it. And it also incentivized CVs that had kind of masculine language as well, right? So I think something like executed, it looked for those certain words. And I think it took them like 3 years. They built it over 3 years and then realized, okay, it's actually penalizing women. So they ditched it, right? But I think the moral of that is, like, capability comes out in different ways, right? And especially as a female developer, someone who is very passionate about, women in STEM, how do we make sure that capabilities that we think signify like success or whatever, that we kind of flip that a bit? So a developer that isn't necessarily, super loud and super opinionated and, can like burn through crap loads of features, maybe capability comes out in something different, which is asking different types of questions or being just a bit like spicy. That's okay as well, right? And so that's what I'm trying to do as well, which is like, how do we hire people that don't necessarily look like what success has previously looked like?
Really terrifying to, I keep going to like worst case scenario in my head. I'm like, oh, so we had an
Yeah.
AI that was meant to help us hire people and all it did was reinforce hiring the same stuff we'd always done. I'm like, so the opposite of what we needed.
Yeah.
This actually reminds me of something that I read a piece about. One of the construction companies was trying to hire more women. And so it posted an ad on Facebook, and Facebook's AdSense thought, oh, it's a construction job, I should just push it to all the males. And it got 0 applications from women, and it was just men in the applications. And so how do you counter that kind of this has to be something that went into the training data, right? And so for something like this to be basically vetted and cleaned and sanitized, how would anyone go about something like that?
AI isn't a crystal ball, right? It doesn't show the future. It reflects our past. And, that mirror is unflattering, right? So because we're not building neutral tools, we're actually building systems that make these kinds of decisions. And so that Facebook algorithm, they should be, doing like bias testing to make sure that you're getting the same outcomes based on variables that shouldn't matter. So gender should not matter when there's, a keyword like construction. That kind of is what motivates me, right? Which is, how do we train AI to be unbiased? How do we kind of train out the bias? And the only thing that I can think of is it's really up to the developers to keep on, asking those questions on what does our data set look like, knowing that it already is biased. And because sometimes equality isn't the answer. Sometimes it has to be kind of like equity, right? Which is, okay, I already know that it is biased towards this. And so how do I offset that by kind of, giving it more female data or more data that I'm blind to, right? I think it's very, very easy to choose the sunny scenario.
Yep.
But we always have like negative test cases. We should have adversarial personas that test all of that logic. I mean, I can go on and on about kind of data set cleansing and all of that. We know it's kind of hard as well to get data sets. And so then we go on and then we create synthetic data, which has an even further problem, right? Because you're using slop to create more slop. But I think it's about having diverse people to ask those kinds of diverse questions, and also going to like experts as well, right? So, you don't necessarily just have to ask your team lead or your product manager. It's about going to someone who looks so different to you, right? And then asking, hey, what do you think about this?
Yep.
I've learned so much from just asking people who I wouldn't even think about using, like, I don't even think they would use my product, and then they give me a totally different point of view.
When you talk about models and kind of the biases, so trying to offset those biases to get equality, and so how do we do that? Because for me as an engineer, like, we're using the end product that already has some sort of harness around it. So when we're kind of building in these things, is that at like the harness level that's kind of using the model to try and, it's something's gone in, you get the result, and then you're trying to build off that response? Or are there other ways that you can kind of retrain? And this is coming from someone who knows nothing about the inner workings of models or harnesses.
Yeah, I think kind of bias and, you know, responsibility definitely has to be in the harness. It's not just bolted on at the end, right? So if you think about AI, it doesn't have values, it just finds patterns. We have to give it values. And so how do you bake in these values at the start, right? You have to think about the fact that AI is doing exactly what we asked. We just keep on asking the wrong questions. So if we ask it to optimize itself for engagement, it will. But if you ask it to optimize itself for safety, then it will be better. Um, and at the keynote, I did talk about kind of frameworks like compassionate design, right? And that's at the kind of the start of the harness, right? Which is you haven't even started coding. So how do you start asking those questions around what's fair? What does fairness look like? What does safety look like? Who's our most vulnerable user? Who can be damaged by this if things go wrong? That's at the start of the harness. And then you think about, okay, what kind of bias testing can I do? And so that's in the middle once you've done the coding, thinking about your blind spots. And then I talked about kind of AI being a checker because we know that AI is really, really good when you split it up into focused tasks, right? So you have a generator AI and then you have the reviewer AI, and the reviewer is optimized for safety and it reviews everything that the generator produces. And so there you have like a harness which has kind of safety and responsibility baked in different points of the flow. The harness isn't a feature, it's the actual foundation. And so if your values aren't in your architecture, then you're pretty much failing as soon as you start coding.
Yeah. So if you kind of tacking in on at the end, it sounds like you're closing the gate after the horse is already bolted at that point. So
Yeah.
and it's very hard
Yeah.
to undo damage once it's been done.
Yes, for sure. And I think about it like a soccer team, right? And so you can't just have like the goalkeeper being the last line of defense. You need it in kind of every part.
The keynote, you mentioned one, and this is the one that really kind of struck home for me about damage. So you
Yeah.
mentioned that there was a company that released an AI to convert images into professional kind of headshots, right? And you said
Yeah.
that men were putting in images and it was coming back, with astronauts and construction workers and, beefy, bulky looking men. And then women were putting them in and getting sexualized content back. But why? And you talked about, that most of the internet has been pumped through some of these models.
Yes.
As the old kind of joke goes, that the internet's for porn. Like porn is a huge use case. And you're like, so if we're training these
Yes.
models on porn and we're
Yes.
not putting safety at the core of what we're developing, it's like it seems like an obvious conclusion that teenagers could be using this and then getting sexualized content of them back. And I'm like, that's like opens a whole host of ethical and legal and
Yes.
moral implications.
Exactly. And so what they found was women were getting back 16% of the outputs were coming back topless or sexualized. Asian women, it was the results were even more pornified, right? And so you kind of think of how do they even test this? Um, and it could be that as a white cis male, you looked at the output and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And if you think about a teenage boy putting in a picture of, a classmate, a female classmate, and her coming back topless, then that's reaffirming things that we don't want. I think what worries me is that becomes normalized, right? That, women being sexualized without their consent, it becomes normalized. And, oh, it was just AI, right? And Elliot, you mentioned before about like what it's been trained on. It's been trained on like 5 billion images from all over the internet. And in 2023, Stanford did a study on that that data set, and it contained violent imagery, racist content, just, and porn. So, of course, if you're training it on images that are a bad reflection of us, of course you're going to get bad outputs.
So kind of going back to what we can do about fixing this sort of stuff. So it's about putting those safeguards in place every step of the way, from kind of making sure the data set isn't polluted with, discriminatory or negative things, trying to cancel out the bad. So what do we do when it's like we don't have the data that we need to be more representative?
Yeah. And actually, I purposefully omitted kind of training and cleansing data sets, because as a developer, that's not necessarily what you would be doing anyway, because that's kind of, something that the data scientists will do specifically. And so I really wanted to focus on, as like, let's call it the everyday dev, what you could do. And that's compassionate design. So asking who can it hurt the most. I think if the Lensa team asked that, like, oh, what do we think could go wrong with our imagery? It produces sexual output. That's probably not a great thing. So how do we test for that? And then that goes on to bias testing. So how do we test as someone that doesn't look like us? Where are our blind spots? And so instead of just testing what does good look like, actually test for what does bad look like. And they would have found that straight away. And then the third thing is the reviewer. So we actually have in our release harness that AI checks AI. And so you have a specific AI reviewer that tests just for safety. And so if they had built something that said, was sexualized output produced when no sexualized content was requested, they would have caught that.
There was another one you, during the keynote, talked about, which I think, could have been equally damaging, where it was to do with medical treatment, and it wasn't trained on other ethnicities. It was mostly on Caucasian or white people. And so I think you said one of the stats, I want to say it was around like 56% or something, where people from Black communities have to get a lot sicker before they get the same level of treatment.
And so it was a healthcare algorithm used on 200 million Americans. And what it did was, because it's pattern matching, it used healthcare costs as a proxy for healthcare needs. And so if you think about healthcare costs alone, Black patients historically have had less access to healthcare, so less healthcare costs. But then the AI concluded that they were healthier, but they were just underserved. And so Black patients had to be 26% thicker than their white patient counterparts to be assessed for needing that level of healthcare. And then researchers found it and found the issue afterwards, but it still affected 200 million Americans.
It takes me back to that story where they were trying to figure out if a plane, after World War II, they were trying to figure out where to basically plate the planes. And they were like, oh, we'll just plate wherever the bullet marks are, because that's where all the bullets hit, right? Because that would be your intuitive response. But then you should just do the other thing, and you should only bolt the places that don't have the bullet marks. Yeah.
They had the image of all the red spots on the plane, and they were like, these are all the planes that came back. And it's like, yeah, so if you got hit on any of those other spots, the plane did not come back. So you're like, therefore, these spots are fine.
That's it. I think when you're using AI, you do really need to think about kind of what its limitations are. So don't use it as your decision maker. Use it as a good drafter, right? And especially for devs, like obviously I use, Claude Code to vibe code and everything, but also I do use it to prove me wrong. I constantly say, this is my thinking, prove me wrong. Or if it gives me something, then I go, okay, I copy and paste its content into another session. And then I say, this is what I'm thinking, prove me wrong. Right. So you actually get AI to scrutinize itself. that's where I think it's the most valuable. And I think that that's what people should be using it for. It's so good at finding patterns, but it's also really, really good at reaffirming thoughts and beliefs that aren't necessarily correct. And so you need to be conscious of that as well.
Yeah.
AI is very good when you break it down into small, focused tasks. So if you use it to ask the right questions and give it the right focus, then it's actually really, really good. If you want it to tell you that you're right, yeah, be really good at that as well because of the way in which we created AI, which is through reinforcement learning, right? It was built by saying, yes, that looks good, rewarded because it was right. So, of course, it's going to keep on doing that same pattern. And so, if you ask it to give you pushback, then that's when it will be good as well. If something feels a bit off, then you have to say it's off because the more we accept slop, the more slop we will get, right? And I say this and tell this to my friends who aren't developers, who don't know, like, how the sausage is made. I think you have to ask it what it might be wrong about. And I think as humans, we've been trained by sci-fi to like either fear it or worship it, right? But actually, probably the healthiest relationship is just to use it as a skeptical collaborator, right? And I do believe that vibe coding is the best thing. Like I wouldn't just let AI build something on its own. You do need to review it at every step, and it's not just with coding; it's with everything.
Have you found you find yourself kind of in review fatigue when you're
Yes.
getting it generates a lot of code and you're like, great, now I have to review way more code than I would have ever written because it does generate a lot.
Yeah, and you can go so much faster. I think that's where we'll start to see our roles shift. It won't be in writing code, and you would know this. It will be in reviewing this for correctness. But then that's where we have the power to review it for fairness, give it a different kind of lens that it's blind to, right? And I think when people say, oh, AI will replace our jobs, I do think to a degree, but it just means that we get elevated. And so our role is how do we remember what it's like to be human and give it the human values that we want it to?
So it's a pretty big responsibility on the shoulder of the developers, both the ones using the AI as well as the one, the data scientists creating the models, and then the engineers building the harnesses.
It is, but it's not up to the ethicists or the politicians or the executives or even just to the product team. It's up to the developers to ask the right questions, sneak in a few good tests, give like what will give you reassurance that you're creating the right thing, right? Because it's our responsibility. We always hear this, which is like crap in, crap out, where we're literally the only ones that can create something different. I think there's something really lovely in that.
So how does it sounds like you've already told us the answer to this, but because you worked on and built Jamie. So how does Jamie solve for this kind of or some of these kind of problems when it comes to safety and responsibility?
Yeah, so I mean, Jamie exists because when I researched the market for AI companions, I found that there wasn't anything out there for women. We know that women aren't adopting AI as quickly as men. So then we're getting ourselves into a gender data gap as well. But also, AI companions that are out there at the moment are pretty much designed for heterosexual men. But also, I found that there was nothing out there, designed with ethics at the core. So that's what Jamie is doing. It's about giving space for women who don't necessarily have someone or something to talk to. They probably aren't technically apt enough to, use ChatGPT for prompt engineering and to prompt it into something safe for them. So that's why we've built it. But also, I think it's about kind of just creating something that makes you feel like you've got someone or something to talk to. And we knew that vulnerable users would use our product. And so we had to create something that wouldn't replace human connection, but rather enhance it.
Very cool. Sreyna Rath, CEO and co-founder of Jamie.ai. Thank you so much for being on the Seek Bytes podcast.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thanks, guys, for
Thank
having
you.
me.